Okay. Hello, everyone. We gave it a minute. I think we're going to go ahead and get things underway. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and probably night for some of you out there. Thank you all so much for being here. And welcome to Developing a Vision for Improving the Discovery and Access of Bathymetric Data, which is a webinar series put on by the JEPCO Technical Subcommittee on Ocean Mapping and the IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry. Next slide. My name is Jennifer Jenks, and I, along with Dr. Vicky Farini, will be serving as the series organizers and host for the week. Both of us as members of TSCOM, and then myself as the director of the IHO DCDB, and Vicky as the head of the Seabed 2030 Atlantic and Indian Ocean Regional Center. We are both very excited that you all have chosen to be here today, to join us as a community, to listen to and to discuss what's working and what isn't when it comes to the various aspects of the bathymetric life cycle. Next slide. So just a small bit of background on the organizations that are behind this event. The TSCOM provides technical advice to maintain and improve JEPCO products and the supporting data, while the DCDB is the recognized IHO repository for all ocean bathymetric data, with the intention to provide preservation and discovery and access to those data. Both organizations look to you, to the community, for guidance and for suggested direction on how best to drive our work. Next slide. Both of these entities also strive to support Seabed 2030, which is a collaborative project between the Nippon Foundation of Japan and JEPCO. Seabed 2030 aims to bring together all available bathymetric data so that we can produce the first definitive, freely available map of the global ocean by 2030. Next slide. Seabed 2030 is meant to act as an accelerator to fast track JEPCO's aim, and as you can see on the map here, they are. In 2016, only 6% of the ocean floor had been mapped to modern standards by data that had been shared with the global community. And last year, that number had increased to 23%. But obviously, what remains is a lot. Next slide. And we know there simply aren't enough survey ships out there with the spare capacity to map 3/4 of the ocean floor in the timescale we're looking at. And we know we must work to expand our community of mappers. In addition to using what we have, we need to embrace new technologies and new sensors and new platforms. Next. But, and this is a big but, we also need to focus our efforts on harvesting the data that's already been collected, but not yet shared with JEPCO. We believe that perhaps another 20 to 25% of the ocean floor has actually already been mapped. It's just that the data has not yet been released. Next slide. 20 to 25%. That's a significant amount of potential data. Data that, if contributed, would allow the community to focus on collecting new data in unmapped regions. But why? Why do these data remain unshared? So this is just a quick list that jumps to mind. But perhaps we should be checking our assumptions. Perhaps there are other reasons that haven't been considered. And so to close this data gap, we need to first understand why it exists, and then all of us as a community work together to eliminate it. And with that, I'll pass the microphone to Vicky.
Thanks, Jennifer. Next slide, please. So the intent of these sessions is really to gather input from you, the global community. We recognize that we are somewhere along this continuum of collaboration where we've been networking and starting to coordinate. We really want to move towards cooperation, collaboration, and ultimately integration, because by working together, we can more quickly and efficiently meet our collective needs. Next slide, please. So why are we having this webinar series? Jen did a great job setting the stage for us, but we really want to do things a little bit differently with this series. We want to identify and understand current activities and plans. We really want to hear from the community about what the challenges and needs that exist are. A big intent of this workshop series or webinar series is to inform an in-person hybrid event that we will hold on the campus that I sit at in New York, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which is part of Columbia University. And during that event, we really want to develop actionable plans to achieve our common goals. This can include guidelines, workflows, tangible steps that we can take to move our community forward, not only to meet the goals of JEBCO and CBED 2030, but to meet the needs of our global mapping community. We really, really want to understand and learn from the community what is needed and how can we work together to deliver what's necessary to move us all forward. Next slide, please. Some of the tangible outcomes that we're hoping to produce through this series of events include white papers that capture and describe the work that's being done, and also help to lay forward a vision for the future. Where do we as a community envision that we're going? How much commonality is there across what several people in the community are thinking? How can we work together to get there more efficiently? So we're envisioning best practice white papers that we can put out to help move our community forward. We really want to also identify in those white papers some of the cultural and technical barriers that exist to data sharing and describe some of the solutions so that we can break those barriers and move forward. A roadmap that defines ways to integrate information, describing data coverage in particular, is a very important tangible outcome. We've done a lot of work to try to get more information available, and we'll hear about that in the second webinar in the series, but we really want to move forward into even more productive ways. And how can we do that? So some of the technical steps that we can lay out. Ultimately, we really want to foster progress within our community that is coordinated and really avoids redundant effort. We want to optimize efficiency. And while we're doing that, we want to foster a culture of open sharing of data, of workflows, and of knowledge. Next slide, please. So what to expect from this webinar series? We're having 4 complementary panel-led listening sessions related to different aspects of bathymetry data management, sharing, assembly, and access. We really wanted to do things differently with this so that we can not have the traditional presentations where the audience is mostly listening, but we really want to engage the audience in providing feedback and giving us your input about what you need, what your challenges are, what great things you're doing. This together with everyone's input, I think, is going to help us define a future vision and move us beyond 2030 in really productive ways. So this virtual conversation is meant to inspire and gather input and commentary from the broad community. And we hope that the format that we've put forward for these webinars will help to foster that kind of exchange. Next slide, please. As for logistics, we are broadcasting this live on YouTube, and we're hoping that many of you are tuned in live. We're also recording it to YouTube, so you can share this with your colleagues so that we can gather more input from more people. During the session, we will be doing some live polling to get input from the community, and also there will be opportunity to post questions and comments. After the sessions are over, after the series is over, we will be contacting the community for additional input via web form and/or email. And all the results of what we gather from these listening sessions will be shared with the community online. And again, we'll feed into the planned event that will take place in May. Next slide, please. So very briefly, just an overview of the different sessions that we'll be having this week. The first one that we're going to do right now is really focused on data sharing, obstacles to data sharing, and solutions that exist that might be shareable across the community, distributable, to help remove the bottlenecks in data sharing and really promote access, reuse, and preservation of data. Next slide. The second session, which will be later today, is focused on data discovery and identifying data gaps. And in that session, we'll be talking mostly about the use and integration of web services for data discovery and access, and advanced geospatial applications related to data-driven decision-making, for example, related to opportunistic data mapping to fill gaps in data coverage. Next slide, please. The third webinar, which will be tomorrow, is focused on data access and community needs. The panelists will be discussing how to improve the availability of bathymetric data and how they use the data that gets put out there. What are their needs? We really want to make sure that what we're doing as a community to put data forward is meeting the needs of a diverse community of users. Next slide. The final session, which will be 2 days from now, is focused on data processing, data transformation, and data integration. And it will get into some of the technical details of how we currently are processing, transforming, and integrating data, what kinds of products are being produced, how those products are being disseminated, and what the future vision is for how we might do things as technology continues to provide new opportunities for doing things in different ways. Next slide, please. All right, so before we start, we wanted to thank everyone. A huge thank you to the session leads who've put in a lot of time planning with Jen and I to pull this event together. A huge thank you to the panelists who've also taken a lot of time to prepare and to participate in these conversations. And also a big thank you to the community for your engagement and your efforts, your contributions to our international efforts to map the ocean, and for your input to help us figure out the best path forward that will meet all of our needs. And with that, I will hand over to Christy, who will take on leadership of this session. Thanks.
Thanks, Vicki. Let me just get on over to my slides here. All right. Okay, can everybody see my slides okay?
Yes, all good.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. I am very thrilled to be here to lead the data stewardship session of this webinar. My name is Christy Reiser, and I am a bathymetry data manager at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information and the co-located IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry, or the DCDB. Alongside our panelists today, I will be voicing my opinions as well on some of the questions posed with the perspective of a global archive. So today we're going to focus on data stewardship, obstacles, community needs, solutions, data sharing, and metadata. And as Vicki mentioned, our goal for today's session is to gather information from the community and panelists on these issues that we will then bring back to the table and seek solutions for in our in-person workshop this May. I will be posing a series of questions to the audience as well as to our panelists throughout the session. And I really encourage everybody in the audience to use the polling platform to type in your answers and to the audience questions that I pose. So you can access this by scanning the QR code on the left side of my screen here. You can also go to an internet browser and type in ahaslides.com/J2WF3. And I'm just going to leave this QR code up during our presentation so anybody can join anytime. If at any point you don't agree with the multiple choice options and you wish to expand on your answer, feel free to add a comment by clicking on the Ask a Question bar at the bottom of the screen in AHA Slides. This will bring up a dialog box where you can submit your questions or comments. You may also, of course, use the comment section in the live YouTube stream. Now, we may not address your comments or questions directly in the panel today, but your answers are going to be captured and synthesized for our workshop. So I'm thrilled to welcome our 4 panelists today. We have Tion and Suzanne, Helen and Son, and each panelist is going to have a chance to share their screen and give a short introduction on who they are, what they do, and how their role applies to data stewardship. But before we begin the introductions, I'd like to pose a question to the audience. Again, feel free to use the QR code or just type into your internet browser, ahaslides.com, and the code is listed there. So let me just launch that first poll question to the audience. What is your goal for sharing data? We've given a few different options here. We'd love to get a little baseline understanding of what the community that is actually participating right now, how you use data stewardship. So feel free to go and answer that question. And now we can move on to our introductions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And let's start with Suzanne. Suzanne, would you like to take over?
Sure. Let's see. You should be seeing my presentation now.
Yes. Thank you.
My name is Suzanne O'Hara. I'm from Mont Doherty and the technical director of R2R. And my experience with multi-beam is I started working with multi-beam in the mid-'80s before scientists had access to programs like MB system or anything. Helped with the development of MB system and have worked with many systems since then. The reason I'm here has more to do, and I apologize if you hear any background noise. I'm having some repairs here. My presentation today and participation is because I'm part of R2R, and R2R's task is handling the raw data and trying to ensure that it gets reliably off the United States academic research fleet and a few private vessels who have joined our group, and distributed to the archives for long-term storage and to data experts for processing into products and stuff. We don't generate products ourselves, except for basic quality assessment and accessibility to scientists who want to see where the data is. And before R2R started, it was the responsibility of scientists or operators to get data to the archives, and it often ended up not happening. So we've really been able to serve a purpose. And a quick review of where we have data is shown on this map. And as far as multi-beam goes, we have about 66 terabytes that have come through R2R and made available to the public, which is almost 2,000 cruises for 14 different vessels. And that's a brief introduction of R2R and why we want to participate in this discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Up next, we have Helen, Dr. Helen Snaith. Do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah, so hopefully you can. There's the share button. There we go. Can we see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay. So yeah, I'm Helen Snaith, and I'm head of the data service group at the National Oceanography Centre here in the UK, and the data services group actually incorporates the British Oceanographic Data Centre, or BODC, which some of you might be more familiar with. And I'm also here with a second hat on, which is head of the Global Centre of the Nippon Foundation JEVCO Seabed 2030 project, or Seabed 2030 as it's more commonly known. And I guess I have two slightly different perspectives on this question in those two different roles, because what we do in those two areas is slightly different. We're a slightly different kind of side of the coin, if you like. BODC is a marine data centre, so we are a repository, and we form part of the UK's Natural Environment Research Council Environmental Data Service. We are the part of that data service that has primary responsibility for marine data. And the Environmental Data Service is a trusted UK facility providing data stewardship services, ensuring environmental data of long-term value are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, or FAIR, which is an acronym which I would be surprised if we don't come up against a few times in today's discussion. But you will see that the Environmental Data Service has data stewardship services as its primary responsibility. As the UK's National Oceanographic Data Centre, we are also recognised within the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission framework within IODE as that UK National Data Centre. And on a more local perspective, we are an accredited data archive centre within the UK's Marine Environmental Data and Information Network, or MEDIN. BODC provides access to a very, very wide range of data sets. We have of the order of 130,000 unique data sets available online to download, plus additional data that are not yet findable and available for download data. Those data sets cover, I'm going from memory here, but I think it's something like 60 or 70,000 different parameters, of which bathymetry cover a very, very small number of parameters. So ocean depth is one of those multiple thousand parameters that we actually serve from our data sets. Within the BODC, we cover the whole range of FAIR activities. So we provide secure archive, provision of metadata, transformation to long-term standard formats, all those things that are covered in data stewardship. We are, I think, considered one of the world leaders in the area of marine vocabularies and semantics, which is, it's how you describe your data. It's how you can create machine readable descriptions of your data, which is absolutely essential for the interoperability aspect of FAIR. Within Seabed 2030, we have a slightly different role. We are working in partnership through that project with the IHO DCDB, who, as you've heard from Jen, have the remit for archive and distribution of the public data. So they are the primary repository for the data within Seabed 2030. We also work with the regional centres who generate the grids from those source data, and we provide access to the final products. In a slight difference from our role as BODC, we don't provide direct access to the source data, but we do hold metadata on those source data. And one of the things that I think I would like to kind of highlight here in the whole area of data sharing, which cuts across both the BODC activity and the Seabed 2030 activity, is the area of attribution and credit for data sharing, which brings you into the wonderful minefield of data citation and how you actually ensure that the people who have put effort, like the R2R processing, actually get the credit for the effort they have put into data that are made public. So that's it from me. Back to you, Christy.
Thank you so much, Helen. Excellent. How about we move on to Sean? Sean, do you want to share your screen?
Yes, I can do. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, you should see my screen there now.
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from. And thanks, Christy, for the introduction, and also to Jennifer and Vicky and the team for arranging today's webinar series. So my name is Sean Haughton. I am a scientific and technical officer here at the Marine Institute in Galway, and I'm working on the INFOMAR program, which is Ireland's national seabed mapping program. I'm primarily responsible on the geographical information systems side of things, but also participate in hydrographic data collection, curation, and database management as well. So just to give a bit of a background on INFOMAR, it is the integrated mapping for the sustainable development of Ireland's marine resource. So this programme is funded by the Government of Ireland through the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. It is a jointly managed venture by the Geological Survey Ireland and the Marine Institute. And it is the successor to the Irish National Seabed Survey, which ran from 1999 to 2006, where the INFOMAR programme was implemented with a remit to complete bathymetric mapping of Ireland's seabed by 2026. So in that context and to date, we have mapped approximately 780,000 square kilometres of our seabed, which is about 88% of Ireland's exclusive economic zone. How we do that, as I mentioned, it's jointly managed. So the Geological Survey of Ireland manage the mapping of all areas within 30 nautical miles, and the Marine Institute manage the mapping of all offshore areas outside 30 nautical miles. And on the bottom there is our current fleet of vessels, which includes the newly delivered state-of-the-art research vessel, the RV Tom Crean, on the bottom left. In terms of our primary products and what our deliverables are, we produce high resolution and backscatter data freely available to download through our download portal. And these are produced at standard resolutions of 10, 5 and 2 meters. Offshore data is slightly higher, and the data can be produced at higher resolutions depending on the need. The data do have integration involvement across a wide range of areas, which includes ingestion by EMODnet for seabed classification, habitat maps. They also inform marine protected areas and marine spatial planning designation, offshore renewable energy. They have a huge underpin and impact on marine research in Ireland, fisheries, navigation, and also maritime archaeology. So just in the context of today's discussions, and I think it kind of encompasses what we can look at, and it feeds into our collective effort, and that is looking at the start with the end in sight. So rather than providing a list of challenges, it's more of a continuum, and I think this was mentioned at the outset as well. One of the biggest issues is defining user needs. So not only identifying what these needs are, but also keeping up to date with the changing environments and demands on these. The next biggest challenge is actually maintaining these, and that is down to resources. So this is a huge challenge in terms of how we meet these needs, and this goes from survey operations, data acquisition, data processing, data stewardship, right through to final delivery. Maintaining standards of knowledge is also huge, and this is applicable within organizations, between organizations, both nationally and internationally. And finally, through exercises like today, communication is at the forefront, and this kind of brings the continuum back around. Again, through webinar series like today, if we can communicate and constantly update each other on these needs, then hopefully we can fulfill the aim to colour in this map as we near towards Seabed 2030. So again, thank you to Christy and my fellow panelists, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Back to you, Christy.
Thank you so much, Sean. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen again. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes. Do we have one more presenter, Tion?
We do. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I just got very excited to start our discussion. Hang on just a second. Tion, can you please go ahead and share your screen next?
Was that, sorry?
Yes, can you go ahead and share your screen next and do your short introduction?
Okay, thank you. So this is just the introduction, or it's the 5 minutes one, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so yes, so hi, are you seeing my screen now?
We can, yeah, now you're gonna go into presenter mode. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, okay, so yes, so my camera's not working, so I've tried to look for like a really good picture of myself, just to help with having a face behind the voice. So so my name is Son. I'm the hydrographer for Kiribati. So my organization is the Marine Division under the Ministry of Information, Communications and Transport. And I've been sort of fortunate to be in this role as part of as recently graduate of the program in ocean mapping at the University of New Hampshire, which is sponsored by the Nippon Foundation. So I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. So some of the things that are concern for us is in terms of, knowledge is power. It's sort of the, traditionally that is how we see knowledge, and having the advantage of knowing where fishing grounds are and how to navigate the deep oceans. That is kind of the mindset that kind of has transitioned into today's sort of work in how people are sharing data. But I think it's good to remind us what the value of the data is that we're collecting. When we talk about data, we're talking about the amount of money that is spent to collect it, to store it, and also just the value of what the data is. And I think and then in terms of the barriers that are encountered, that is one of the issues, is that the ministries or stakeholders tend not to want to share their data because of that mindset that knowledge is power, and that give them an advantage. And so in order to sort of kind of perhaps not break this sort of mindset, but just to get a sort of clearer understanding of why we need to go into sharing of data and why it's important. I think the first thing that for us, it's from our experience, is engagement, especially at the local stakeholder level, and not just engagement, but maybe having one or two meetings, but that continuous engagement in order to sort of build relationship, build communities. And so once we have that in place, some of the work that beyond the local stakeholders, you can start looking beyond that, and then you can start looking at other relations outside of your local stakeholders, such as looking at your regional partners. You might want to work with your neighboring countries. For example, for us, we're working closely with Tonga and Fiji in trying to understand how they're building how they're sharing data using the IGIF model that they're currently working on. We're also looking at working with regional partners like NOAA. Like recently, NOAA had a visit to Kiribati to help us with the IGIF work that we're currently undertaking, that will be part of not only the National Spatial Data Infrastructure, but also the MSDI. And then we have also, continuous engagement with donor partners, because you need to communicate with donor partners, as they'll be providing you with the needed funding that that will support your work. And then most importantly is to communicate this, to engage the local communities. And when I say local communities, going down, communicating what our work is to the locals, the local schools, the village elders, the youths. And then another important aspect as part of engagement and communications is to be involved in international work. For example, the CBED 2030 one avenue that we saw as part of our initiative to show that sharing of data is an important part of contributing. Not we are contributing not only at the local level, stakeholder level, but also at the international level at this arena. And so basically what we are looking at in terms of sharing data and sharing it to the encouraging the sharing of data, we are looking at from a holistic point of view, looking at developing our MSDI in terms of the role of work that I'm doing. It's only a small part of what we are envisioning in terms of a national data infrastructure, so that we engage more of our local stakeholders and just continue that communications, having the various components of, say, the hardware, the software, and then the governance components, and then that will move down to the people and its users, which I think is probably the most important component of the the data stewardship aspect. So that's just an introduction from my end, and I really appreciate the opportunity and the time to speak in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Son. Thank you, all panelists, for your introductions. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Son, if you stop sharing your screen, I'll be able to. Excellent, thank you. Okay, well, we can see here that several of you have answered the poll question, so thank you very much. Before we jump into our first discussion topic, I'd like to launch another question to the audience. So let me bring that up real quick here. What do you consider your primary roles to be? We'd like to get another baseline understanding of who all is participating today, so feel free to answer that. Okay, I'd like to invite all my panelists to turn on their cameras if possible, so we can jump into our first discussion question. Excellent, thank you so much. Okay, so I've put the first question on the screen. Panelists, and I know that you just kind of spoke to this and touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper. What is your role in data stewardship? What community do you serve? And what do you like to know, people to know about the work that you do stewarding data? And anyone can start, whoever wishes.
I'm happy to jump in on that, because I think I covered some of this in the preparation, but I think with my BODC hat on, I have, or BODC, I should say, not me personally, have a role right the way through the whole data stewardship journey, I guess, from working with scientists in planning what it is that they are hoping to achieve, right the way through to delivery of those data to a wider community, with all of the archive data transformation, metadata collection that's involved in that entire process. And with that BODC hat on, the community is, I guess, the widest possible community of people who are interested in marine data collected primarily through UK research programs. So in one respect, it's a very much wider community than the bathymetric community, because it's any kind of marine data, and it's also, that's still a global community, but it has a kind of, because we are only involved with the data, well, not solely, we are primarily concerned with data that are collected through known research programs. So we know the people who are collecting our data, and we're actually working with quite a constrained environment. Those people are funded to collect data. We are funded to make their data publicly available. Moving into the Seabed 2030 space, we still have that global community of people interested in the data, but we have a very different contributor base, because we're dealing with people who are collecting data for a huge realm of reasons, and that puts a very different context onto the data stewardship issue, because we're not involved with them at those early stages of planning. We come to the party late when it comes to a lot of the contributors through Seabed 2030, which puts a very different context on that data stewardship role.
Thank you so much, Helen. That's a really great point. Do we have any other comments from the other panelists?
Yes, from the R2R point of view, we collect not only multi-beam data, but all the standard underway products. And I see our data stewardship role in generally collecting and making sure it's reliably documented and usable. All the data collected on the United States research fleet and a couple of private vessels, but also getting it to our community, which would essentially be anyone who wants the data. It's supposed to be released within 2 years, if not right away. And we hopefully get data to specialist repositories so they can do the products and processing. Like with multi-beam, it's snapped up right away and used. So I think that's really useful. We do hold a few types of data that we serve directly because someone hasn't stepped up for those kinds of data. But so I think it's important to have the data well documented, organized, collected with the metadata that lets people know what's going on, and in formats that are easily identified so that the end user can have them in a way that it's productive.
I think this is a great lead into my next audience question, which I'm going to launch right now. Where and how do you share your data? I'd like to see some of the audience participation in this so that we can also see how that will lead our discussion. Son, do you have any comments about about data stewardship and your roles, and any more you wanted to share beyond your introduction?
And they skipped you again. Like seriously, these people.
Sean or Son?
You.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah. So yes, for me, I think for my role, in this is perhaps is to sort of bring together the needs of the community, both at the say at the stakeholder level in terms of ministries, as well as the community that we serve, like at the village level. What are their needs, and then to try to engage them, engage them in a way that we'll be able to seek donor funding for example an MSDI or an SDI, in the sense that it will serve both the stakeholders as well as the communities, given that we have very limited funding, but using these engagements and allowing them to share their views on what is the type of information that they would like to gain access to and what they like to share. Is something that we could coordinate. So that will be our role in that sense, in this data stewardship sort of method. So thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you. I see. Thank you to the audience for participating. I see many of you are answering the poll question. I'm going to go ahead and launch one more while we're having continuing our discussion. What kinds of bathymetric data do you share? I'd like to gather this information as well. Sean, do you have any comments as well?
Yeah, I think just seconding on from what Suzanne mentioned there in terms of documentation, it's hugely important. From the context of INFOMAR, we have been gathering bathymetric data in Ireland since 1996. So over the span of 30 years, the processes, procedures, and standards evolve, and they go through many, many hands, you know. So it's really difficult to maintain that continuity. So in 2019, the Marine Institute actually received international accreditation as an oceanographic data center through its quality management framework. And this has helped enormously. I will caveat that I'm an early career scientist. I'm only in the field just over a year. So for me, coming in as somebody new and to be able to pick up on all the expertise that has been shared down throughout the years and updated is hugely, hugely important. And I think it will become ever so more important as the need for more data and higher resolution data becomes apparent. In terms of our community, I mean, as I mentioned, we serve like a broad range of scientists, fisheries, chemistry, biology, geologists as well. We also acquire water column data as well as magnetometer data, sound velocity profiles. So aside from the primary products, again, there is a huge challenge in maintaining and curating that data to serve INFOMAR's remit, which is to have it all open access.
I think you all briefly touched on this as well, and I appreciate that because it really leads us into the next discussion topic, which is the barriers to data stewardship, and I'd like to kind of jump into that a little bit more, spend a little bit more time on barriers, because I do think that it'd be really great to see the perspective from each of our panelists on what barriers they see, because they may be quite different from, especially differing countries as well, and not just. And I'm hoping the audience will participate in that too. So moving on to the next slide, my question to the panelists here is what barriers do you encounter in your roles with data stewardship? And I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll question because it's quite similar for the audience. And whoever wants to start, go ahead.
I'm going to jump in again. So I think that what we see, particularly, I'm going to concentrate on Seabed 2030 here as being that very bathymetric focus, and we see a really very wide range of issues. One of the most basic, which often I think gets overlooked, is the amount of effort that it takes to get data ready to be shared. So even when there are tools available to help you, you need to put some effort into making your data available. So I think some of the most successful programs out there, and I think the R2R is an example of this, is where you've taken, and I'm going to focus here on the research aspect of it, but you take the researcher out of the equation almost and say your data just goes straight to the secure repository, and that's a model that works very well when you have all the resourcing available that Sean was highlighting. You also have data collecting funders who consider that that's an important part of your process, that the data are out the other end, and you have to be able to understand your data. When we look at outside of that research community, a lot of those things aren't there. So the data funder in a commercial aspect may be funding the data collector to do something very specific. That data collector doesn't have the resource sitting around to do the extra bit that needs it to be made public. They need to find either internally and say, you know, this is something that commercially it's worth us putting some money into, or find external pots of money or external routes to work that through. But just that pure effort, that step of there's something else I've got to do can be a real stumbling block.
Thank you very much, Helen. That's really enlightening too, to hear some of the struggles that you see. From my perspective at the DCDB, and you can see this from the question, the poll questions. It's quite very much my perspective. You know, I work with a lot of data providers, and I also work on regional and national mapping campaigns and international mapping campaigns, where we try to identify data not yet held at the DCDB and bring those data to the archive. And some of the biggest barrier that I see is the bandwidth of our data providers. It takes a lot of effort for the data provider to, you know, organize the data and make sure that there's proper metadata and attribution. And you know, not everybody has the time or the funding or the staff to provide all of that. And sometimes when we track down data that is already existing, we sometimes see a big problem where the point of contact is no longer available. And so we don't know who to go to find metadata, or maybe the data lives on a website, then it begs the question, who is going to go pull it down and organize it and make sure that the metadata is correct? You know, there's all these different struggles that we see from the archive perspective at the DCDB. You know, sometimes we see limitations with embargoes, or even just unwillingness to share data, which also happens. So that's a little bit of perspective for me. Anybody else have a comment?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, actually, even if you look at the topics on the poll there and kind of unpack them a little bit. I think we often find that a lot of the main issues we encounter are human rather than technological, you know. So whether this is through geopolitics, commercial sensitivity, academic embargoes. So if you strip that away from the equation, it's important to highlight that in reality there is no negative consequence to sharing open data. You know, this is fundamental, especially in trying to get a global collective. I do think on the other side, and Helen, you mentioned it there, in terms of like in the science community, like quality control can be a dark art in some aspects, you know, and I think scientists often strive for perfection, you know, and you almost will never achieve that. So you continually go back to your data, which then feeds into maybe fear of misuse or fear of reputation damage. So these are our slight challenges as well. And I think it's highlighted there massively is the time and resources to actually curate that data outside of your own repository and get it out there onto the open platform are huge challenges. So they're all really valid points, yeah.
So I just want to bring up, R2R was specifically created, proposed and funded because of some of the issues we're talking about now, and relying on individual scientists to have the resources and the interest of getting the data properly documented quickly to some sort of repository or other. And we found before R2R, sometimes the data distributions coming from the vessels would end up in a desk because they wouldn't know how to read the tape or whatever, or they only had a small amount of interest in a particular type of data. So we solve that problem by working directly with the operators of the vessels and come so that they would standardize their documentation and distribution. We had some suggestions, but we're willing to work with them. And they just give it to us. And we use many different methods working with the operators because some boats have very small staff, maybe not a lot of technical resources. And the data gets to us generally in less than a year. Some of the operators are very fast at it. So that solves the problem with the scientists having to remember to send the data and get the right documentation with it. The other thing we do is one of the required pieces of metadata we have is who's the chief scientist, so that we're sure the credit goes to the person who was funded or in charge of collecting that data, because we all come from the science community and know how important that is. So we were trying to solve those problems and not put additional weight on the science community to do it. And in the end, initially, it was difficult for the operators because they saw this as another task they had to do. But once they realized working with us made it easier, because all they had to do is collect the data and put it in some standard way, and we worked with them to do the rest of the steps. And our relationship with the operators has really been good. And they come to us with, how can we do this better? We got new equipment. One thing I would like to mention, based on the previous poll having to do with how people supply their multi-beam data, is I think it's wonderful people are supplying products and putting that extra effort in. But having been involved with data collected over a fairly long period of time, we've found that it really is important to make your raw data available to the community in a reliable way. Because what happens is you might not envision the future use of that data, or there might have been a problem in how it was processed, or there's just no downside. Even if you have questions about what Sean said about people worrying that they'll be judged by the quality, it's raw data. No one's judging you. It's just should be out there, because things change over time and their uses you can't even imagine now that people might want to do in the future. And once the raw data is gone, all we have left is the product someone already generated.
I know Helen wants to say something, but I'm going to interject real quick. While we're here, I just want to say that's an excellent point, Suzanne, especially from the perspective of the DCDB. Preserving the raw data provides so many different uses to the community. And I often have to reiterate this with my data providers who sometimes don't want to share the raw or even the processed. And sometimes they don't understand why the raw is important. And as you say, it's one thing to provide products, but if we don't have that raw, we can never go back. We can never go back to the original and reprocess as needed. And we often at the DCDB have customers using our bathymetric data viewer to download these raw data for their own purposes. Maybe they're a PhD student and they'd like to generate a grid from their own work, or maybe other people want to reprocess for other reasons. So there's always a reason to maintain that raw data. So yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that. Thank you. And Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I want to pick up on the point. I think both Sean and Suzanne said there that there's no downside to making your data publicly available. And I think we are, to a certain extent, preaching to the converted here. We all believe that. We are coming from that perspective that data sharing is good. That is not a universally held belief, certainly not internationally. There are some very poor case studies where people who don't have their own data center, they don't have their own local repository, they don't have their own services to be able to process and deliver their data, have made their data available and then find they aren't getting the credit for the data that they're producing. Now, it only takes one bad story like that to get around, and you can undo years worth of work in encouraging people to make their data publicly available. So ensuring that the credit gets back, Suzanne, you mentioned there the PI in a science perspective, and make sure that that's absolutely credited. But in some areas, it's not necessarily the PI, it's the funder that's important, which might be a national institution, or it might actually be the vessel owner who is the person that you need to credit. And I just wanted to raise the other area that, again, I think Sean mentioned very briefly, is the political aspect of it. Bathymetry is very, very politically sensitive in the way that most other parameters that we deal with are not. So that the shape of your coastline, the extent of your EEZ, all of which have bathymetric control involved in them, the approaches, the safe approaches to your nation, these are quite politically sensitive issues. And there is a genuine both financial and political aspect to bathymetry, and in particular that more coastal shallow water bathymetry, which just adds an extra nuance to people who, there may be people who want to share their data and just aren't actually sure whether they're allowed to, and it's easier to just not share than to try and go through the hassle of working whether you are allowed to, and if you are allowed to, what the route to sharing might be. So I think one of your questions is, I don't know where to start or who to go to. I think one of the other questions is, I don't know who would tell me I'm allowed to, is maybe a subset of that.
These are excellent points. I'm so thrilled we're capturing all of this. So thank you, Helen. Son, would you like to chime in as well?
Yes, thank you, Christy. I'd just like to add on to Helen's point as well. So like with small countries like Kiribati, where they don't have the infrastructure or the sort of the means to do to collect data or to share data, but having an open data archive is actually very, very beneficial to us, which is having access to that information is fairly sort of to our advantage. And so we, from our side, that's perhaps the reason why we are also putting our hands up to be part of the Seabed 2030, trying to encourage our neighbors to do the same, because it's also what you're sharing. It's a matter of you still have control over the data, even if you're sharing it at the international level. And I think that there are we share just re-educating the our decision makers on what exactly you are sharing, as because even if you're sharing it at the international level, your data, you still have control on what it is you'll be sharing. And that's something, I think, a message that should be echoed to especially here in the Pacific, where we're very reluctant to share our information, and just to emphasize that there are certain levels of data resolution and information that countries have control over. So thank you.
No, that's an excellent point. Thank you so much for sharing. I think this really speaks to the whole reason why we're doing this webinar series. And the whole reason is we want to bring the community together. And we have so many varying perspectives. And it's great for me to sit at the DCDB and talk all about the barriers that I see, but if I don't hear from the community, I can't help change those things. And same with you guys, you can't change those things to make them better if we don't talk to each other. So this has been really, really exciting to hear your perspectives on all of this. I'd like to go ahead and move on to our next topic, which is very, very related, and we've already talked a little bit about it, and that is the community needs. So sometimes it's hard to see exactly and identify what our community needs. So I'm going to go ahead and move the screen to the next question. And thank you, audience, for participating. It's great to see these little numbers going up and down. It's wonderful. So panelists, how do you gather input from your community with respect to their needs towards data sharing and stewardship? So this can be related to a lot of different things, and I kind of left it as an open-ended question so you can really dive into what issues you see individually. And anyone is welcome to start. Oh, come on, we don't have the
Okay,
shy.
I was giving them the chance. I was giving them the chance, Christy. I'm happy to kick off and
Please
put some
go ahead.
ideas here. So I genuinely think this is one of the most difficult aspects of data stewardship is the requirements gathering, because there's a very easy trap of working with the people that you work with and responding to their requirements. And they are the people who will, you may be delivering your data in a particular way or using a particular technology. And you know that if you want to change it, you don't want to lose that group of users, and there are a kind of captive set out there to go, okay, so if we change it like this, is this going to work with you? So you kind of have your captive pool. The difficulty is those people who aren't engaging with you, because if they're not engaging with you, how do you find who they are and find that they have needs that you should be addressing, but you don't know how to? So that your standard, user fora or questionnaires to users just don't work. Going beyond that is a lot of effort. Going beyond that involves finding the communities that you're not engaging with and finding a means to work with them. So Seabed 2030 is very much engaged in this field. And there is a lot of work now going on trying to use the local communities. And I think it's great that we've got Tion here who can bring, I guess, probably not from one of our typical user communities. I think myself, Sean, Suzanne, we're very much kind of developed research communities is our primary both input and use, I would suspect. I know we have wider commercial users, but there's still a big core of users, this is one where I genuinely think we need input, probably from outside of the science community, on how do you engage more widely with people who might want your services.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic for sure to see all those different communities that are affected. I know from my perspective, working with the DCDB, our community needs are really specific, and that is that we provide a lot of support because we also require a lot of different things. We require that data that comes to the archive be formatted in a certain way. I need to make sure that the data formats are appropriate. I need to make sure the metadata is appropriate. So there's a lot of communication that has to happen. And I know that that can be challenging for data providers, as we mentioned before. I did go ahead and launch the next poll question. And I did want to ask the audience and really anybody here, what would make it easier to provide data to open archives and repositories? What would make it easier? That's the goal, is to try to identify solutions, to these problems. So asking the community directly, like, how can we help? How can we make this easier? Yeah, does anyone else have a comment?
So R2R, the community we're aware of, we have a fairly wide range of community. We have the national repositories, which define what they want, how they want to receive it. We have known scientists that are regular users. We also we've gone and had an advisory committee for many years that we tried to get from a wide range of community in the US, so that we meet once a year and they tell us where they feel we should improve, where we're not doing well enough, where we're exceeding, is the webpage accessible, all sorts of things. And then we rotate people on that and try to get people that we don't already know really well. It's hard to do, as was said. Helen said that you only know the people you know. So, but we do have input from all over the world. We get emails with data requests and information. So I guess in a way, R2R is lucky in that we have the same kind of data coming through, and we already have many channels where people contact us with questions or suggestions. But we certainly would be open to knowing where we're not meeting needs of the community and how we could do things better.
Son, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So just from perspective from as an example here, much of our work is around helping with with the data that we provide to help with helping with making informed decision making, and I think that's a core component of the work that we're doing. So, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are only part of of the information that is required, to supply government as well as the local communities, on issues that, for example, coastal inundation, where might, what might how might the waves and and the rising sea levels impact communities in terms of saltwater intrusion. And then this would trigger, government's planning on, where vulnerable communities will be, and the sort of funding that they'll be allocated, and the resources that will be given to them. So that's sort of in our area of space. That's sort of how we sort of work our way in terms of providing the community with that information. And for us, it's a continuous process of engagement and communication. It's nonstop. And so we're continuously, engaging people in that area, so that situations change, and also the type of information that we collect, as technology gets better and better, we also try to improve our methodologies and the type of information that we can provide. Thank you.
These are all great perspectives. I really appreciate the comments. I also appreciate the audience. I can see them typing away here in our question box, asking about what would make providing data easier. I think these are already some great comments here, and appreciate your input. We will definitely be taking this information back with us. Sean, do you have any ideas? Or Helen, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sean.
Thanks. Yeah, just briefly, I mean, they're all really great points, and I think it kind of encapsulates everything. I do recall back in Southampton, at one of the technical subcommittee meetings, it was phrased that what you'll often find is, scientific people in a scientific room sharing scientific ideas, and it just goes around in that circle. And I think Helen and Suzanne both mentioned it there, Again, just from an INFOMAR context, I mean, I mentioned that we are scheduled to finish mapping by 2026. So, we won't stop once everything is mapped. And I think that extends to seabed 2030. You need to have continual engagement with the community to ensure maintenance, continued delivery. Once it's done, the data flow doesn't stop. All the repositories need to be maintained. I think for us, one of the huge benefits in Ireland, again, just with the fishing community, is on the feet, on the ground engagement is hugely beneficial. And again, I'm conscious that that's not always possible globally, depending on where you come from. But at least through that, it serves as some form of a proxy or some case study that you can then embellish on a little bit further. But yeah, we submit our data to EMODnet as well. It's a huge community. It's almost Europe's central repository in some instances. So it's a difficult one to address directly, but I think pretty well covered there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Christy, I think there's the point that Tion was making there about the links to policy and those end users who, from where I sit in a data center, but I think also within seabed 2030, we're still a stage separate from the people who are doing that kind of policy decision. There's still a group of people who sit between us and those decisions, and I like what Sean was saying there about the getting down and actually being able to talk on the ground. But if you can't do getting those case studies involved, because I think the case studies do get your interim users involved. And one of the things that I think supports the public sharing of data is the so what question. Because if the so what question is well, it would be nice for somebody else to get a nice bit of research out at the end of it. Well, so what? What does that benefit me? So the impact case studies, I think, give you a much better opportunity both to engage with potentially with different users, but also to help bring back the arguments as to why it is so important that the data are shared publicly in the first place.
Yeah, these are all excellent points. I think, Helen, you've already touched on some of the things we're going to talk about later as well. No, and this is excellent. It's just all these things kind of just come together naturally. That's why we're having these discussions. And I'm definitely going to be asking that so what question down the road to the audience as well, because that is a really important topic. Like, what's the purpose? And if we can define that really well as a community, then maybe we'll have an easier time with that data sharing topic. So thank you all so much for your input. I'm really also thrilled to see some great comments in the AHA slides. I do want to also encourage the audience, if you haven't done it yet, if you have a comment you'd like to add that is not relevant to the questions, or you just have an idea or a question, you can use the Ask a Question bar. So you just click that and it pops up a little dialog box and you can submit that to us. So if you have more thoughts and ideas to share, please do so. This is why we're here. Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to our next discussion section, which is solutions, solutions to data stewardship. So I'm really hoping that the audience participates for these questions as well as our panelists. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide here. Panelists, what solutions have you or your organizations come up with to overcome some of these barriers that we have discussed? And I'm going to go ahead and launch the audience question to give them some time to type in answers as well. And anyone is welcome to start. Helen.
Yeah, I can jump in there, Christy. I think it was touched on, and we might touch on it again later, just in the context of metadata. Depending on where you are globally, there are different standards required for metadata. And I know as a GIS analyst, it is sometimes the most time-consuming part of the job is curating the metadata. It can be laborious, painstaking, and then if you have to replicate that workflow for a different repository, makes it even more so. So again, I think it was brought up there in terms of that, like machine readable, a cloud-based platform that could possibly automate that process. That's something I think we're moving towards. Depending on what GIS environment you use, there are ways that you can automate the import of metadata in batch ways. But again, depending on where you send the data, there may still need to be tweaks. So, I think metadata is often overlooked as a whole. It's hugely important. Provenance of data is massive. I think it gives visibility and transparency, and it's already been touched upon in terms of, who gets credit for the data, where it's traced back to. But actually getting that embedded in your data, that's a huge task. So I think, automation of certain processes is something we're at least moving closer towards, and that we would be happy to share once we've validated the process.
That is hugely important. I'm very glad that you are moving towards that, and do please share with us when you have figured it out. I think from the DCDB perspective, one of the things, as you said, that, a lot of times you have to create metadata and then you have to make another set for whatever repository or archive that you submit the data to. And that's something that we have seen at the DCDB as being an issue as well. But I would love to encourage our community to more widely use our freely available data packaging tool called CruisePack. This was developed for our archive so that creating these metadata records are not nearly as challenging. You know, it's a user-friendly little piece of software with drop-down boxes and things like that that automatically generates a metadata JSON file, which then we can, you know, programmatically scrape. And so it really helps speed up the process for that, and it helps save time for the data provider on our end. So we're trying to encourage the community to do that as well.
Yeah, one of the sets of tools that is quite important in metadata, and particularly in machine readability, is the area of controlled vocabulary and semantics and ontologies and how those speak, which kind of addresses the issue that you were talking about, translation from one version of metadata to another. There are, I think there are a number of initiatives going on to try and standardize this across bathymetry, but they're tending to address very specific areas. I mean, we've had trouble within CBER 2030 for something that you would have thought would have been a solved issue, which is just being able to uniquely identify a contributor's organization. Now, this is there doesn't appear to be a solution that's out there. If you want research organizations, there are vocabularies that control that. If you want marine organizations, there are vocabularies that kind of address that, but covering all of your potential organizations who might contribute data, we haven't found anything. And I'm loath to do something that is bespoke to CBER 2030, because that goes against all the rules of shared vocabularies and services. But that's just one very small part, but quite important part of our metadata. Being able to, if you like, being able to collate your essential metadata and then share that without necessarily having to always embed it in your data is one of the moves that's now I think starting to gain some traction, which is particularly useful for people who are wanting to do stuff in a cloud-based platform, or wanting to do stuff delivering data automatically over what might be fairly bandwidth limited networks. So being able to generate your metadata over here somewhere and assign it some kind of unique identifier, a persistent identifier that you can then embed within your data. And those metadata can then be read by other systems, and you can put the interpreters onto that metadata into your own systems and your own requirement. So it moves the requirement for translation from the person who's pushing the data to the person who's reading the data. So the provision is in a standard format. You know exactly what you're providing, and people can move that. So this is something that's being moved towards in a number of areas. I'm not aware of any of the services in bathymetry yet that provide this, but I think that's a move that we should look towards. So, for example, just the instrument metadata, being able to describe what kind of echo sounder it is you're using, or what kind of GPS system it is you're using. If the responsibility for describing that goes to the manufacturer, it's done once. You then just have to reference it. You don't have to go and find that information, because you know my instrument is one of these, and you point to that source metadata. So it's just I guess I'm possibly touching on some of the metadata questions, but I think it's also around this, you know, what are the tools that you would want to help here?
No, absolutely. And we can mix and match our topics as well. It's not a problem to do that. Does anyone else have any comments on sharing any solutions that you have found within your community?
Yes, I want to mention what Helen said about control vocabularies is important, and we've been making a large effort to participate in that rather than create our own all the time. Also, one benefit we have, I mentioned before about how we're working with the operators, the vessel operators, and getting the metadata out from the operators helps because they actually know what equipment they were using at the time. They can provide manuals, they can provide calibration information, they can provide equipment logs that the scientists may not have available to them. So that's really improved the flow of metadata and device information traveling with the collected data over time. The other thing we've been trying to do to help, because we realize at R2R that we're not the experts in everything. We're trying to do a piece of this work, is we've gotten involved with a lot of the best practices programs and specialty science domain experts, so that when we're doing quality assessment or trying to figure out what metadata is needed, we don't make that up ourselves. We try to find the community who knows what they're talking about for each of the data types. And they're out there and have been very interested in participating. So that's how we've done it, is try to find experts in the field. And it's nice if you can get a community of experts that are working together, because that way you don't bias what you're saying on one way of handling data. So that's kind of how R2R. And the experts tell you things that you might not expect. And once again, slightly off topic, but the kind of thing where traditionally operators might only run equipment that the scientist on board wants, whereas the experts are saying, just turn it on, run it. Somebody might want that data in the future. So don't waste time turning the multi-beam off just because you have a biologist on board who might not want it. So there's things out there that learning from the community helps.
Yeah, I'd like to also add to that you know, a lot of places and the Okeanos Explorer, for example, and one of our NOAA ships, they do transit cruises as well, and many other organizations and data providers that send data to the archive, the DCDB. It's really, really important if you can just turn that switch on, leave it on while you're transiting. It's still data. It's still valuable. So that's definitely a big perk if we can get even more. And a lot of times you can even plan to, if we work together as a community and you do your survey plan, you could even see where the previous lines are and just scooch right next to it. So maybe you're not going over the same data set, you know. There's many ways to do that. I'd also like to say that, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later too, but the importance of thinking about data management prior to data collection, it can also be a really good solution. It's all too often data sharing and data management is an afterthought. And maybe it's because there was no funding available, or maybe there wasn't capacity. But if you think about what your plan is to do for sharing and you integrate that before you even collect the data, and as Suzanne has been talking about, working with those data providers, you know, and being able to develop a relationship so they know who they can call and they know where to go to for those answers, I think that can be a really good solution as well. Does anyone else have another comment about data solutions? All right, well, let's move on to the next one, which is the meat of it, the data sharing. So we've already touched on this quite a bit. We're, as Helen said, we're all preaching to the choir here, where we're wanting to all share our data. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Oh, just FYI to the audience, I saw that somebody asked the question, where can we find Cruise Pack? And I went ahead and dropped a link to Cruise Pack in the comment section there. So that should be visible. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So here's my question to the panelists. What ideas do your organizations have on accelerating the delivery of data to archives? And my audience question is very similar, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the poll questions so our audience can participate as well. Anybody have any thoughts on this?
I think the answers to the answers that you've suggested in your poll probably cover the areas that we're all looking at. So the improvement in the number of services, yeah, I've just seen that the answers pop up, and it's yep, everybody, we need all of these things, and I think that is true. The bit I'd like to actually focus on is on this incentivizing data contributions, because I think this is a tractable question, and I think it sits very much within the remit of the data centers, the data, what might I call them, the EMOD nets of the world, and the JEBCOs and the Seabed 2030. So the people who are producing the products for example, if you go to EMODnet, you can find who has provided data into different sections of it, but it's not quite as simple as you might think, particularly when what has gone into EMODnet is itself a product that has been generated from a number of different sources. And it involves me as a user going and digging that in. As me as a contributor, how do I find that my data have effectively been cited because somebody has used the EMODnet data and cited them? If I consider JEBCO, we have exactly the same issue, and I have to say we're not quite as advanced as EMODnet in providing that metadata layer behind it yet. But that question is still there. JEBCO itself, the JEBCO dataset, Global Grid, has a DOI associated with it. It's probably one of the most highly cited data sets that there is out there, because anybody that's used it to generate a figure in their science paper can quite happily use that DOI and cite it. But the people who've contributed into that citation doesn't filter back down again. So the hierarchy of and it's not just DOIs, the hierarchy of contributions and how you get that back up the stream, I think is something that there's a lot of work through organizations like AGU that are looking at the whole process of persistent identifiers and how you trace that citability through usage. But it is an important one, and it does come down to this incentivizing data contributors. If you as a researcher get, okay, my highest cited paper is this, but my highest cited data collection, because I put it into a public repository, is this, and you get credit for it. There's a lot of work to do in that realm.
Thank you, Helen. Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, I would second that quite strongly. I think the higher the aggregation, the more difficult it is to give credit at the individual levels. And I think, it's easy, let's say for me, representing INFOMAR, which is a government-funded program, but this is particularly pertinent to maybe developing nations or institutes that are setting up any mapping program or want to join this community. What's in it for me? I think, Helen, you had mentioned it earlier, and that is the question. So to be able to provide that acknowledgement and attribution, I think, is hugely important. It also means then, if you're trying to leverage funding from whether it is government funding or otherwise, you need to provide some metric on where your data is going, how it's being used, again, case studies. So if these if the attribution and acknowledgement gets diluted to the point where you actually can't trace the provenance of or where it's going, it becomes an issue, and then you lose that incentive for sure. Yeah, it's hugely important.
Thank you very much for that perspective. I also kind of want to bring the conversation back to where we were discussing before about raw versus processed data, and apply this to data sharing and see maybe there's a difference between raw and processed data if there's a willingness to share. Is it consistent regardless of processing level? Does it matter to the data contributor? You know, that might be another thing to think about, and I'd love for the audience to type in some comments using the ask the question bar. Share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from the community if that would change your mind, if sharing raw versus processed or products, you know, whatever, how you think of that. Son, do you have any comments as well from your perspective? Do you have any ideas for how we can accelerate data sharing, maybe within your community?
Yes, thank you, Christy. I think from our perspective, it's just a matter of so the formatting that could be read with say for non-commercial software packages. I think one of the issues for us is trying to access information or data and then not having the right tools to be able to use in order to work with them. And I think perhaps, you know, if at this stage, where in our stage, we you know, we still need to sort of educate the you know, some of the stakeholders of the information that's out there that could help with some of the work that they're doing. But the problem is they don't really know how to use that information or that data, and then vice versa. If they have information or data from their end, how do they contribute? And I think we're sort of still in the infant stages of trying to involve our community in that area. But hopefully, as you know, as technologies improve and as we engage more with them, we will start to be, you know, in that arena where we're able to not only be users of the data but also contributors in that sense. And I think a large portion of it is through, you know, being involved in forums like this to get more involved. And I think I'm probably only representing a small portion of the community, say for instance in the Southwest Pacific. And so I would really be something, you know, just to engage them in that area too, so that you know, there is that interaction as part of to be engaged in this sort of platform. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Son. That's a really good perspective to have too, and I think that this really touches on our next question within data sharing. I actually have another question for the audience. I'm going to just leave the audience question up, which is, I'm going to just swipe right by that one. There we go. How can we encourage more data sharing? And so I'm really hoping that the audience takes this another option or idea as go put in your answer, go type it in the ask a question section. But another question to the panel is how do you think, wait, I'm sorry, hold on a second. There it is. I want to talk more about, you know, the why share the data. You know, this is what we mentioned before, is it just because it's the right thing to do? Is it because of policy? Is it because we want to map the ocean? You know, there's so many different answers to that, and I do hope the audience can send us some of their answers as well. But does anyone else want to touch a little bit more on why do we want to share data? I want to see more perspectives on the reason behind it.
I'm thinking about historically how we've seen changes, and some of the things why people weren't sending raw data, because that's the first step, was one, we've all touched on giving people credit for the work or the funding they've acquired, be it raw or processed. So how do we track to give credit and provenance? And another issue that came up, and it was mentioned briefly here, is some people are hesitant to share raw data because they feel somehow it'll reflect badly on them, that the quality might, because it's raw and they haven't had a chance to massage it and to educate the community that raw data is raw. That's what it is. It comes with the warts and everything else. It's just, if it's got the metadata, it's up to the people to use it. And it's not a question of not doing it correctly. And so with these things, we kind of need to start a cultural change in understanding what raw data is and what you're sharing and why sharing is important, and try to make people realize your job isn't done until you've shared the data. And whenever possible, I do understand sometimes there's maybe government restrictions, but the idea is somehow we have to make the people who are doing the effort to collect that data understand that we recognize the effort they've put in, and that the biggest step would be to share it for the future of science, for the larger community, however we can do that. So that would be my 2 cents.
No, that's really great, and such a great perspective. You know, it is really another question I'd like to ask both the panelists and the audience is if your organization is opposed to sharing data, what would change your mind? You know, we'd love to hear ideas on how we can broach the subject. Anyone else have a comment?
I have one. It's a slightly off from where you were saying, if there's an organization that doesn't want to share data, how can we encourage it? But even in organizations where data sharing is encouraged, it tends to have a very low priority with a lot of scientists. And the reason for that is that it doesn't have a big impact on their careers if they provide their data or not. So that cultural shift that you were speaking about, Suzanne, I think that needs to go much more broadly. And we can look at it in terms of carrots and sticks. The carrots, we need to be out there from the organizations that employ people. So if you are a research scientist and you are making your data publicly available, that should be something that you get credit for in your career progression. So this is, you know, if your institution actually provides rewards, you get career opportunities, you get progression opportunities for delivering data sets, for making data public. That's the carrot. The stick is one that potentially, particularly in the research community, can and probably should be wielded more often by the data funders. In that, I think for certainly within the UK, I suspect across a lot of the US and within Ireland as well, most research funders require you to make your data publicly available. How many times is there actually repercussion from that data funder if you don't do that? Does your data funder actually withhold funds, not just from you, but for your wider research organization if you haven't made your data publicly available? That's the kind of stick that an institution will understand, that can potentially be used to drive that more positive reinforcement, that if you do make your data publicly available, you get those career progression opportunities, because otherwise your institution isn't going to be getting its funding. So there's a lot of kind of wrapped up things that can be used there to support. But the the impact case studies, the so what still needs to be there in the first place, so that those organizations, those countries, those funding bodies where data sharing, public data sharing isn't the norm, that message still needs to be got over to say this is why you should be doing it in the first place. And I think that generic, because it's a good thing, is probably not enough when you're having to put your hand in your pocket to do something to make it happen. There needs to be a step beyond that.
It's a lot of different layers that you just walked us through those. Excellent. No, it's so good. I went ahead and launched one more question for the audience, and I'm cognizant of time here, so I'd like to move on to our last discussion question with the panel. But I would love for the audience to take a moment after I move forward. If this is an issue, if quality assurance is a barrier to sharing data, and can this be addressed by the community, please feel free to answer that question by ask a question, pushing that little button there. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next section, which is on metadata. We've already talked a little bit about this, so I'd like to revisit and see if there's any final thoughts. Are there any other deeper issues that you've seen with metadata and attributions, especially within your organizations?
I think metadata, I mean, Sean's mentioned it a couple of times, that metadata and issues with metadata are probably the most time consuming. It probably takes longer to sort the metadata than it does to clean the data for a lot of bathymetric data sets. I would still like there to be a more concerted agreement in the metadata that is expected. So there are still differences between the metadata that you need to provide to submit data to DCDB and the metadata that are required for EMODnet, and the data that what we require within GEBCO. We've tried to do some standardization with EMODnet so that we have a matchup of fields in that context. But if we're not, if there's a fairly small community of kind of large data centers responsible for collecting data, we can't agree what the essential metadata are, then there's not a lot of chance to spread it more widely. And I realize that there is going to be institutional reluctance to change the metadata that we currently ask for, because that then involves changing all the systems that are using those metadata. But if we can put the effort into the mapping between those metadata systems and providing the tools to help people with that, I think that would go a long way towards helping us in getting the information that we want.
You know, I think it's, I'm just going to comment real quick here. I think it's a great idea to have more standardization of metadata. However, I did just get a message from Vicky Farini, and she made a great comment that there are different needs and different use cases for metadata. So it is hard to make that standardization. And so this is exactly why we need to see these different perspectives. And I'd love to hear more. Son, go ahead.
And yes, thank you, Christiane. Helen, I totally agree with your comment, and especially coming from an area where we're just sort of beginning to develop our own systems. I think it's good to see, you know, how we would actually develop it so that, you know, we are aligned with, you know, our data with the metadata. You know, which sort of platforms do we need to align to in the first instance? Because once we get it wrong, it'll be a you know, a much harder path to sort of to try and get back to, and then, you know, like you said, you know, there's the implications to the cost involved and how we will further, develop these systems. But and I think, yeah, that's just from the perspective of, the countries that are sort of just starting out. In terms of the platforms that they're currently developing, like for instance, Kiribati. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else have any other comments?
Yeah, I think it was one thing I had written down in notes previously, and Vicky does make a good point also. But even in terms of the time and resources, that some form of global metadata standard that can be adopted by everyone, it could help at least on the higher level, and that's because what ended up happening in our institution, for example, is that we internally micro manage the metadata. We do it in a certain style for our own repository, and then for emodnet and et cetera, and it just snowballs. It's also, I think, hard to get people to buy into the concept of metadata because it's not glamorous and it is tedious. It's not like producing a lovely bathymetric grid that you can do something with colors with as well, So again, a paradigm shift maybe in terms of how we look at metadata and how we present it as maybe of equal importance as the data itself is something that we could look at. I think Tion touched on it as well, maybe a little bit outside our own organization, but just globally, I think the assumption of the provision of access to resources and digital resources globally on some people's behalf, that they might not have people might not have access to certain softwares or bandwidth as well, So I wonder a wider support network, especially if there are communities that are getting set up with mapping programs, could be put in place to kind of help along the way. And again, to go back and feed into the importance of metadata.
I completely agree with the previous speakers about the metadata issues, and I think there's several standards out there, and it's good to be able to crosswalk between them with the idea that hopefully they all give similar metadata and it's just a different in vocabularies between them. But I really feel strongly about best practices group and domain scientists working together, even if their end goal is different. They can share information and provide it with the repositories and the organizations serving the data. But the one comment I'd like to make when we're talking about metadata that I've found over time is that it's actually worse when we have incorrect metadata or out-of-date metadata rather than missing metadata. Because if it's not there, we know it's not there and we can go looking for it. When somebody, for instance, populates a spreadsheet and continues to use that for the rest of the time that instrument's ever used, even though they've changed operating systems, they've changed versions, they've had different calibrations and offsets, we can't identify that the data may be wrong rather when it's missing, we know. So it's some way we could, when discussing best practices of metadata, figuring out how do you judge the health of the metadata? How do you get people to participate in maintaining it? So.
These are all really great perspectives. Thank you all so much. I am cognizant of time. I'd like to just take a moment to close up. But before I do, I'd just like to open it up for any last comments before we make our closing statements. Okay, well, thank you all so very much. Huge thank you to my panelists for your thought-provoking discussion. I'm really thrilled to be able to go back to the table with this information and kind of digest it all. It's gonna take some time to think about all that was said, and then be able to take this back to our workshop in May. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to the audience for participating in our poll questions. This is why we're here. We want to ask your opinion. So I really appreciate that you took the time to answer the poll questions and type in questions and answers. Again, feel free to just use that ask a question before the end of the session here. Also, a huge thank you in the background to the behind the scenes team for making everything work. It's not always the easiest thing in the world, as we all know, to make a webinar successful. So thank you all very much. I really enjoyed our discussion, and I'd like to see, does Vicky or Jen, do you have any final things you'd like to say? Mic drop, we're out.
Nope, not actually. I think, let's see if you could go back, Christy, to the slide deck, please. There you go. Let's see. Did we have the next webinar? There you go. Next steps. Perfect. Let's see if I can get my camera to work. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Christy. Fabulous hosting job there, moderating, and just to echo, thank you to the panel. That was an extremely engaging conversation, and excited to look at, to really dig into all the responses from the participants that tuned in today. So just a reminder, this was the first. We have 3 more webinars ahead of us, one starting in 2 hours, I believe, and that's going to be the data discovery and identifying data gaps. So we hope that you all will join us. And again, understanding that everyone has day jobs and lives at home, and that the time zone might not be conducive. This is being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube to check out at a convenient time. We will be issuing post-webinar surveys to the community, also providing another opportunity to answer some of these questions if you were unable to do so today. Because again, the main reason we're doing this is to gather community input. And again, Vicky touched on it at the beginning. We are intending to host a hybrid workshop in May at Lamont Doherty to take all of this amazing information we're gathering this week and to actually produce, to synthesize it and to produce something tangible to help the community move forward. And so with that, thank you all, and